Alright everyone, now it's time for the occult, video number 299. Be obscene. We've got to talk about rebellion, malfeasance, obscenity, taboos, moral judgment, and all of these things. First though, we have to describe what occultism actually is, and I don't mean the subgroups of it. Paranormal studies, okay, like ghosts and ghoulies, cryptozoology, loosely associated with it, although there are people that take more of a rational bent. They're like, hey, Bigfoot exists, but it's just an ape-like ancestor, a hominid, or a Gigantopithecus or something. Or a dude in a gorilla suit in many cases. Now, by the way, illusion, part of the sub-occult as well. Psychic material, mysticism, a historical study of the occult. But ultimately, when you look at them all in a more holistic manner, it's a study of truth, or a search for truth. This is basically what you could call kind of pseudo-religious belief, is that I just like the search. I like to study all available paths, go through them, read as much as possible, often editing works in the process, getting up towards 350 of them now, so it's quite a library that I've gone through, and looking at as many opinions as possible. Like, initially, I would limit myself more to maybe the darker side of things. I was into grimoires and somewhat folklore and herbals, but I hadn't branched out. I didn't do any fortune-telling works until later. Some alchemy, but that interest was later mostly. And then I realized, well, I should be going through all of these things, because if the point is to search for a truth, you have to cast the net very, very broadly. You're going to have to find the needle in a haystack, or the needles, relatively speaking. Now, if the occult is to be labeled ultimately the search for truth, the quest for knowledge, to glean something that's real in a world where much of what you witness is subjective in nature. Like going back through history, medical considered objective things. Often later on we realize that they weren't. For instance, it was once objectively true the atom was the smallest possible unit of existence. We know that that's not true. It was conceived of that it was impossible to transmute materials one to another. While it's hard, you can actually do it. You can do that with nuclear reactions. In some cases. You can do it with a very high-powered laser, very high, strong radiation sources, etc. You can break things down, and yes, you can actually change their atomic nature. Things, especially within science, medicine, politics, and so forth, that are considered to be totally sacrosanct 50 years ago, often now we totally ignore. Completely ignore it. The reality of 50 or 60 years ago is completely different from the reality today. Therefore, if you seek to find truth, you're automatically going to be taboo. You're going to be a rebel. You are going to have no choice but to go well beyond convention. For instance, look at, let's say you're an occultist, it's 1955. Vast majority Christian United States and rest of the Western world, by and large, outside of East Asia and a few other countries. Overwhelmingly Christian. Quite a few moral laws, so things like the occult, which the Victorians didn't have as much of a problem with, despite being arguably more religious at times, had become problematic. If you were into that sort of thing outside of the realm of really like a Ouija board or palmistry or something, if you went further than the very topical, it was considered to be culturally problematic. Maybe you were a communist. Therefore, in order to study materials that today wouldn't piss anybody off, like, hey, I'm reading the Necronomicon, I realize that wasn't published in the 50s, so don't jump down my throat, but let's say some doppelganger, the Book of Forbidden Knowledge. Something that now is considered fairly lighthearted, acceptable, not really a problem, back then it was. So the taboo was broken then, it's not broken now despite the same exact action. See, here's how you know that it's completely subjective. Cultural opinions have changed. What is considered obscene changes over time. 30 years ago, heavy metal, grunge rock, rap music, fucking anything like that, there was a mini moral panic with regards to these things in the MTV era and afterwards, I would argue as well, for some time. Like, oh my god, my kid saw Def Leppard. This is a big problem. Now they've got a denim jacket and spiky boots. And it was considered a terrible thing. Now you can go on YouTube and watch, Montero or something and see someone giving the devil a lap dance. Now, I'm not arguing that that is problematic to me, but it is considered subjectively problematic. Look at fucking Dark Horse by Katy Perry. I know I'm getting off of the topic of the strictly occult, but let me try to explain. That video is raked over the coals for occult imagery or Lady Gaga and stuff, and was considered to be obscene by certain people, but people with certain religious and moral views especially. They don't really talk about it anymore. It's still there, it's still watched, but it's not spoken of. It's not worried about the same way. Now it's Montero or something by Billie Eilish or something like that. Things change over time. But the search for truth, what is actually objectively true, won't change. What is subjectively true within human systems or human understanding of systems will be altered over time. What we call an obscenity is just a pushing back against that subjective convention that changes over time. Now, there are universal constants behind it. They're usually rooted in biology. For instance, it's not a good idea to murder people and kill, and you have to protect the weak and the innocent and stuff. Why do you do that? It's a biological mechanism. It's the genetics of that species, that group trying to survive. The things that are layered over that are sometimes not objective, though. For instance, the drug war. The drug war was incepted to try to prevent death. Well, you smoke weed and you crash your car. You smoke weed, you kill someone. We know that's not the case anymore. We know that's not scientific. That was largely foisted on people by the oil and paper industries. It had nothing to do with legitimate scientific study. This was even disproven long, like half of a century ago, but it was ignored. That's subjective. That's civil convention. That's behavioral convention. So if you're going to look through magic, history, folklore, all of these things, if you read through folklore sometime, you'll find a lot of things in there that are now considered very, very taboo. A lot of sexism, a little bit of homophobia at times, in a more objective sense, ageism and all of these other things, which all these isms are horseshit. I mean, again, they're subjective, they're not even helpful, so I just scoot them aside. But that's what parts of the culture engage in. That moralism is still there. It's just in a different form than it was in the 50s or in the 80s or something. Then it was moral majority conservatives. Now it's lowberals. Same shit, different asshole, basically. If you look through just the works that I've edited, there are statements in there that today would be conceived of as highly racially challenging. And bigoted and sexist and so forth, even within the context of criticism, in some cases would be considered problematic. 70, 80 years ago, nobody gave a shit. When they were first written, those were conventional things. They weren't even close to taboo. Back then, it would have been considered taboo to discuss subjects like sexuality, the divine feminine, sexuality even in historical study, like the concept of tree worship, the concept of serpent worship, Ophiolitria, and so forth. It's a whole series by Hargrave Jennings at the time in the Victorian era on these topics. They were highly sought after, but they were still conventionally very taboo. They were the sort of thing that you read at night alone, and you didn't talk to your polite company friends about. There's something, the poor, the vulgar people are so hypersexual, and we're above that. We only do it under Christ in marriage for the sole purpose of procreation. I don't have a dick. I don't have a clitoris. Don't enjoy that shit anymore. But now, discussing that, especially within a historical context, nobody has a problem with it. Nobody has even if you look at tech, if you look at just at YouTube, like when I first get there at the end of the 2000s, 2007 and 8, a video with two girls kissing, that would get you banned. Meanwhile, Tourette's guy's fine. Someone, the N-word show or something like that, Hitler footage. Those things are all perfectly acceptable. Now we've done a 180, and girls kissing is perfectly fine, yeah, even if they're grinding on each other and shit like that. But you can't have certain political opinions or historical stock footage. It's not allowed. It's verboten. Very interesting how the times change. But if you want to be a cult, if you want to know the actual truth, you have to be willing to be a rebel. You have to be willing to go against the grain, the conventions of society, and say, fuck you. That's essentially what the occult is, basically a big fuck you to convention, which I find very amusing as well. That's about all. Peace out.